My name is Justin Hansford, and I am the Executive Director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University School of Law. And it is my distinct honor and pleasure to be speaking as the inaugural speaker of this important series at the Sandra Day O'Connor Institute. Thank you so much for the invitation to be involved in this program. I wanted to give you a quick introduction to Howard University. Before I begin, I know some people may not be familiar with Howard. We are the leading university in the world serving African Americans in the African diaspora, one of the over 100 historically Black colleges and universities in this country that came out of the Reconstruction era move to educate those who were formerly enslaved. We are at the law school, the largest producer of Black lawyers in the country. And we are 5 times as large as the next largest historically Black college. We have many significant alumni, including Toni Morrison, Vernon Jordan, and of course, Justice Thurgood Marshall, after whom the Civil Rights Center is named. I wanted to talk about my story a bit this morning. It began with protests in Ferguson. Before I was at Howard University, I was a law professor at St. Louis University for 6 years. I lived about 10 minutes away from Ferguson when Mike Brown was killed, and I immediately began to be engaged in protests. I served as a legal observer in the protests. This is myself wearing the trademark neon green legal observer hat. For those who are not familiar with the program is designed for people who are not seeking to be involved in protests necessarily every time they go out to engage in legal observing, but more so to observe and ensure that the rights of protesters are protected. And the neon green hat was supposed to keep me from being involved, and you can see how well that worked out for me. But I did protest, and in addition to that, one of the more important things I did as a person who was involved in the work in Ferguson was put together a human rights shadow report and represent Mike Brown's mother and the family of Mike Brown, and also the protesters in Ferguson as they went to Geneva, Switzerland, to argue before the United Nations that what had happened to Mike Brown and the question of police violence in the United States that takes place on a racial basis, this question is not just a civil rights issue, it's a human rights issue. It's not just an issue that affects people's citizenship rights, but it speaks to our very humanity, and it speaks to our very basic, essential human rights as people who deserve to be free from discrimination and who deserve to live in this society. This was perhaps the most important moment in my career. If you think back to what was happening in Ferguson in 2014, as you know, there was no criminal trial for Darren Wilson. There was no civil trial. So for Mike Brown's mother, this was really the only opportunity that she had to allow her voice to be heard in a tribunal. In this case, the tribunal took place in front of people from all around the world. And she told me that this was very significant to her. And for me, the ability to help her to have her voice heard, to have her dignity recognized, was so significant. It's a shame that we had to go all the way to Geneva, Switzerland to have her voice heard, but I was very proud to be part of that. And I can tell you at that time, there was nothing I wanted more fervently than the arrest and prosecution of Darren Wilson. And I want to stop here and make a quick comment about what is happening today, fast forwarding a little bit. We have heard many people discuss the question of defunding the police or abolishing the police. I myself have gone on a journey from wanting to see people who killed young Black folks like Darren Wilson under the guise of the law prosecuted and convicted, to having to really come to grips with this idea that maybe justice means something besides conviction. Maybe it means something besides um, hoping that helping Mike Brown's mother would best be accomplished through the criminal justice process. Maybe we need something else like a fund for victims of police brutality, reparations. Maybe we need to do something besides think about retribution as our primary mode of justice. But I wanted to flag that for many of us who were activists in Ferguson, who are activists responding to the killing of Eric Garner or George Floyd or others, it's a very traumatic experience, and it's a very generous, very spiritual, very emotional process to try to move forward and think about other ways of obtaining justice for these families. We tried everything we could. We've gone to the courts, we've gone to the streets, we've gone to the United Nations, and we're looking for justice in any way, shape, or form that we can obtain that justice. Um, but I wanted to note that as I moved forward to talk about the other experience I had that was formative for me, my participation as someone who provided in-person testimony before President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. During that experience, I had an opportunity to speak with people who were police chiefs from around the country. And of course, I realized that many of them were individuals, good people who were interested in seeing things get better in our society. But the problem was more the system than the individual. The problem was that many of these people did not recognize that we were not talking about bad apple police officers or the need to isolate individual bad actors and eliminate them from the system. Unfortunately, we have a system that continues on a consistent basis to make it impossible for people to hold those accountable who go to a place where they engage in brutality or who go to a place where they engage in racial discrimination, as demonstrated by the Ferguson report, which I recommend that everybody read, or as demonstrated by so many years of testimonies by members of the Black community. I have found that in my experience, people who try to move through the world from the perspective of ignoring race also dangerously find themselves moving through the world from the perspective of not seeing racial inequality. If you don't see race, you won't see the stark racial inequalities in our society. And even more, dangerously, if you do see disparities in treatment in our society, those disparities may be individualized and found to be the fault of individual people based on their own behavior. Most disappointingly for many of us who are civil rights advocates, our own Martin Luther King Jr.'s words of his desire to see people based on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. That own phrase has been used to argue against efforts to end racial inequality and outcomes in our society, ranging from employment to education to policing. And we have found that those efforts to remedy past instances of discrimination have come up short when color has not been recognized. However, if we are going to move forward as a society, I would like to posit that we have to begin to acknowledge the reality that color blindness should not be our aspiration in our society. Instead, our aspiration should be to acknowledge people in the fullness of their identities and allow people to be proud of their identities and to treat people justly, not in spite of their identities, but perhaps because of their identities, taking into consideration their unique history, their unique experiences with the criminal justice system as a community, and their unique contributions that they can make to our society in the multicultural society that we hope to build for each other. There's a woman named Marion Wright Edelman who runs the Children's Defense Fund, who has moved throughout her amazing career uh, based on the premise that we can judge a society, in her words, we can judge a society best by determining how that society treats its children. And here in this situation, when it comes to race in America and the criminal justice system, we are seeing people as children being trained to have aggression and distrust of the police, who are the stand-ins, who are the representatives of the state and the government in our society. And we are alienating another generation. So the crisis is so urgent, and the time to respond is now. And we cannot do so in a way that is colorblind, but we have to do so in a way that acknowledges that all Black lives matter. But what we've seen from our experiences over the last 6 years, as we continue to explore more and more interventions, is that none of them really worked. It's been 6 years that we since Ferguson, and we have not seen a drop in the number of people killed by police. We've actually seen a rise in that number. From Eric Garner now to George Floyd, it's like deja vu all over again. So we have to become much more willing to speak to people, build community, and of course, like I said, support Black-led organizations where you can do so. You know, I had such admiration for Justice O'Connor's opinion in the decisions around in Grutter and Gratz in 2003, arguing that we wanted to get to a place where affirmative action, for example, would no longer be necessary because race didn't matter in our society. And we're not there yet. We're not at the place where Justice O'Connor hoped we would be in 2020. And we should acknowledge that and try to get there as soon as possible, with the recognition that our goal isn't to make race no longer a entity in American society. Our goal is to make it no longer a barrier. It's not that we want to eliminate the distinctions on the basis of race from existing, because I'm proud of being Black. But the goal has to be to eliminate the fact that people are targeted on the grounds of their race by institutions like law enforcement.
So, what can we learn from the example of Thurgood Marshall, who fought for expanded civil rights throughout his career, despite huge obstacles?
One thing that I would say about Thurgood Marshall, many people know him as the older gentleman in the black robe, the first African American Supreme Court justice. But before that, he was known as Mr. Civil Rights. He was in the 1940s, a charismatic young lawyer who went into dangerous places in the South, representing Black men who were many times wrongfully accused of rape or murder, facing lynchings. And in some cases, people threatened to lynch him themselves, lynch Thurgood Marshall themselves when he went down to the South representing these people. He's someone who faced many challenges over his career and showed courage in his willingness to represent and fight for people, even when the rest of our society and our environment may have made it dangerous to do so. So for me, one of the things I take as an inspiration from Justice Marshall, from his work as a young lawyer, is this ideal of courage, the willingness to fight for on issues that may not necessarily be easy wins, to go to places, whether it's Ferguson, Missouri, or wherever, and be able to say that you are in the middle of really important struggles for people, and you did your best, and you did not let fear uh, determine how you would move in this world in your life. So I take the example from him to have courage in this advocacy and to be clear. And just Justice Marshall is someone who advocated in the courts. He was someone who was in the state house talking to legislators, trying to help move civil rights legislation. He was somebody who was in the streets supporting protesters. He went behind the bench to become a judge. He did not limit himself to one endeavor of pursuit. He used all avenues available to him. Many people think police are the ones who provide us with public safety, but I think that's an incorrect understanding of what police do on a day-to-day basis. Only so 95% of the time police spend in their careers is spent responding to non-violent activities. Most police will go many years without being involved in stopping a violent crime. So I just wanted to make this point. When protesters talk about defunding the police, they're talking about how we can be made safer if we have a broader idea of public safety. So we live in a society, and again, Arizona is a great case in point, where in many cases we don't have enough ventilators for everybody, but police have enough money for tanks and tear gas. So if you thought of public safety in a more broad way, we would be safer with more ventilators for people who are at threat from COVID and less tanks. So if you were to defund the police and fund healthcare, you're making us safer as a society. And that, as was described in Brown by Justice Marshall and all of those NAACP attorneys, if we cannot desegregate our schools, if our children cannot learn next to each other as children, how are they going to learn to appreciate each other and relate to each other as adults? How can we desegregate our society if we are not able to desegregate our schools? I have a great deal of skepticism for anyone who is more concerned about the damage done to a building or an inanimate object than the damage done to human beings and their bodies. If you can watch that video of the killing of George Floyd and then be dissuaded from the cause because you see some buildings burning, I question your values. I question your values. There's a continuum between reformist steps in policing and abolitionist steps in policing. And I can provide this for people later on if they would want to access it themselves. There's a website for this. But things like body cameras, community policing, more training, these are interventions that people have found to not work, to be honest, over the course of the past 6 years since Ferguson. Instead, people are now desiring more abolitionist responses that allow us to acknowledge that there are better ways to create safety in our community than what we're doing now by overfunding the police. Yes, the best way we can avoid losing the momentum for this cause is to ensure that we continue to protest in the streets. And there's nothing else. I don't think that works in the same way. And so the way our democracy works, unfortunately, um, is a way that is it's not proactive on these issues. Unfortunately, in our political environment, it's very difficult to get anything done. It's only when their feet are to the fire that things happen. And right now, their feet are to the fire, and it's got to stay that way. And so I will say this: I do anticipate more protests over the course of the summer. You think about if you think about the summer of '68 or even 2014, protests don't only last for a couple of weeks and then die out. They continue over the course of the summer. So there will be more protests, and I think that will help us to keep our momentum strong. The project, when people call themselves even abolitionists, it's not only a project of dismantling, but it's also a project of building. People who want to defund the police only want to do so when there are replacement measures in place. Uh, Maybe we don't want police to respond with a gun to people who have mental health crises, but that means we want someone who has training in mental health, a mental health worker, a social service worker to respond in their place. Same thing with statues. I've worked to try to create memorials to people of color, to the renaming of buildings in honor of people who speak more to our multicultural legacy. And I'm very proud of that work to try to replace some of these memorials to Confederates who lost the Civil War, to memorials of people who might be inspiring to a more diverse community that we live in today.
Again, we'd like to thank you for your comments today, for addressing these questions, and for sharing the materials that can enlighten some of us who had questions. And we'll be providing the additional questions to you. We'd like to thank all of you for being with us and hope you have a great day. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.